St. Jane Frances, she's kind of a lady after my own heart. She is a prime example of the fact that, well, if she can do it, we can do it. And I think that's something worth thinking a little bit about. She didn't start out being a religious, although she did have a very nice, pious upbringing. But her mother died when she was very, very young, leaving her father to raise the children. So she had some difficulties and obviously a fair amount of responsibility in her upbringing. She was married when she was 20, which in those days was not particularly young nor particularly old for being married. And she had a number of children, 6 of them altogether, I believe, 3 of whom died in infancy, and one of whom at least caused her a fair amount of grief. And then her husband was killed in an accident and died about a week later. And during that week, he maintained a very resigned and even cheerful disposition. And he forgave the man who killed him. But Jane had problems with that. She could not bring herself to forgive him. She resented him, she blamed him, and wouldn't speak to him. And then the Lord began to change her heart. And at least she began to greet him on the street, and eventually was fully reconciled to him. But as a widow and a mother, she was continually looking for something a little deeper. And of course, that deeper was in her faith. And she began to have a strong concern for devotions, for how to put into practice the love of God, and did it primarily through fulfilling her responsibilities as a mother, as a head of a household, as even managing her father's estate and her in-laws' estate. And of course, devoting herself primarily to her children and to the poor, especially when a plague began to afflict that area. She was one who even opened her home to care for the people who were sick, who were thrown out or neglected by everybody else. She came under the spiritual direction of St. Frances de Sales. And Frances and Jane made quite a pair, because Frances was one of the few leaders in the church who recognized that the primary way to reform the church, to bring people from the attractiveness of Protestantism, that was right at the beginning of the Reformation, the attractiveness of Protestantism, to bring them back was through charity and compassion. Not so much through upholding strong doctrine, although he did that, but charity and compassion were the main things. And he saw as the means for that, enabling people, ordinary lay people, the ones living in the world who were in day-to-day contact with all of these movements in the church, enabling them to live what he called a devout life, a life that was in union with God through being faithful to their particular state in life. And with St. Jane Frances, they founded a religious community That was not to be a cloistered, enclosed group of women religious, separated from the world, but would have a strong center of faith and devotion, and then go out into the world and be part of bringing the message of Christ through compassion, through love, through presence among people. In that, it's very interesting, at the same time, St. Vincent de Paul and St. Louise de Marillac were doing something of the same thing up in another part of France. And Frances and Jane and Vincent and Louise had a friendship all together and were mutually influencing one another in their endeavors. So while Protestantism was causing an intellectual ferment in the church, there were also those who were saying, hey, the way that we have to reform the church is not through upholding strict doctrine nearly so much as it is living the compassion of Jesus. So, one other little tidbit about her: she has suffered the indignity, or maybe the dignity, of having her feast day recently, about 15 years ago, bumped by our Blessed Mother. When Pope John Paul II made the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which was December 12th, on the universal calendar to be celebrated worldwide, Jane Frances, whose feast was that day, was bumped to today. Actually, she died tomorrow, August 22nd, August 12th. But because St. Lucy, somebody else has that day, they are now celebrating it today. So we thank the Lord for the witness of people like Jane Frances, whom we actually can imitate. Because how we imitate her is by being faithful. I always maintain that God does not ask of us to succeed. He doesn't ask success. Even in doing His work, there are so many ways that we can fail in trying to do God's work. But success is not our responsibility. God will take care of that in His way. What God asks of us is fidelity. And Jane Frances is a model of fidelity in various ways. To her first walk of life as a married woman, a mother, a widow, and then as a religious. So we just prayed in the prayer that through her intercession that we may walk faithfully in our vocation. What is our vocation now? Whatever it was in the past, what is our vocation now? To be a sign of God's love to one another here. To treat one another as if we were Jesus Christ, treating them, encountering them, so that in us, others may encounter Jesus. And so walking faithfully in our vocation to constantly be examples of shining light. If Jane could do it, we can do it. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. As Jesus and His disciples were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill Him, and He will be raised on the third day." And they were overwhelmed with grief. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax approached Peter and said, "Does not your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes," he said. But when Peter came into the house, before he had time to speak, Jesus asked him, "What is your opinion Simon, from whom do the kings of the earth take tolls or census tax? From their subjects or from foreigners? When he said from foreigners, Jesus said to him, then the subjects are exempt. But that we may not offend them, go to the sea, drop in a hook, and take the first fish that comes up. Open its mouth, and you will find a coin worth twice the temple tax. Give that to them for me and for you. The Gospel of the Lord.